Hi, welcome to Board Gems. This is my weekly video series in which I cover older board game gems, and by request, we're doing a mailbag episode. I got a lot of questions people have posed to me, so many that I've split them up into several different episodes. And this episode is on my opinions. So I'm prepared. I got some pop. This glass, I can confirm, contains Diet Pepsi. I neither confirm nor deny that it also contains famous Newfoundland Screech. I'd like to hear a bit more about your personal view on gems within the context of older conflicting opinions of a game, perhaps colored by contemporary releases, or if you think that is even an issue. I feel there are some great older gems that are simply impossible to obtain for a reasonable price. I see this as different to a gem which was perhaps misrepresented or misunderstood at the time. That's a good point. It's a distinction worth making, and it's true that I don't really make that distinction. I cover both on the channel. I do try near the end usually to kind of mention how easy or hard it is to get. I'm just kind of going through games that I like, so some of them will be hard to find, but there may be reprints later. Some of them are easy to find. But I mean, even the ones that go for unreasonable prices now, usually, if I'm covering them on the channel, they weren't super great hits back then. I'll give you an example, okay, or a couple. Oregon, Raw the Dice game. So these are games that came out, they had moderate print runs probably, and people liked them, but they didn't really set the world on fire, right? They'd be like, oh my god, Oregon's the most amazing game. Nobody was saying that at the time Oregon first came out. Gradually, the number of new copies of Oregon that were available in stores dried up, and the people who had the game liked it enough that they didn't want to trade or sell it away. And so gradually, the game started to go out of circulation, even on the aftermarket. And that's when the price goes up, right? And then it's like, oh, it's impossible to find. But that just because a game is going for crazy high prices now doesn't mean it was always a gem. Actually, it does mean that. What I mean is it doesn't mean that it was recognized as a gem at the time. It's hard to say that a game was like misunderstood at the time. Some are. Like, I think Carcassonne: The Discovery is a great game and is one of the better Carcassones, but it was misunderstood at the time because Carcassonne: The Discovery kind of presented itself as a simpler version of Carcassonne, and that's not what Carcassonne fans were looking for. But the fact is that the rules were a little bit simpler in Carcassonne: The Discovery, but I felt that the changes added a layer of depth that I really enjoyed. So that was a game that was misunderstood at the time, but honestly is still misunderstood. You can get copies of Carcassonne: Discovery for crazy cheap right now. I want to be clear, my video series is not a buyer's guide. I don't want people to watch my videos and then immediately go out and buy the game because Daryl said it was a great game. I'm just one guy, and my tastes definitely do not gel with a lot of where the hobby is at right now. And some of the games I'm going to cover are hard to find now and go for a fairly high price. I don't expect anybody. I always get nervous when people tell me, oh, I bought this game because of your video. And I'm like, I hope you like it. And if you don't hurt me. Are there any modern games, last 2 years maybe, that you think will stand the test of time to become board game gems? I really don't play many new games. I try to play new games that I hear about and I think I like, but I don't have a lot of time to explore new games. And there's so many new releases that come out, especially through Kickstarter, that I can't stay on top of them. I can mention some games that I really enjoyed that came out in the last couple years. Boiled Dock, which is a card game from Leo Coldovini and Ravensburger. That's an amazing game. I love that. I've only played it 3 players. I think it plays up to 6. Spicy is a new game. That's really great. On Tour, Dealt, Patchwork Doodle / Second Chance. They're almost the same game. That's a really good one. My family and I really enjoyed Reef. My wife and I are really loving Spring Meadow. You know what? I don't think any of those games really set the world on fire. So, I'd probably say that those are potentially hidden gems 10 years from now. If you could pick one of the games you've covered for a reprint, which one would you choose? Almost definitely Rhinelander. I think that's an amazing game, and that hasn't had a version. I guess Face to Face would have been the last version, so that would have been mid to late 2000s. I think Rhinelander is an amazing game, and that should be reprinted. But actually, honestly, at the time of recording, there have been cases where publishers have gone, you know what? We try to make like the best versions of these old classic games, and just hobbyists aren't buying them. And it makes me sad. While I think Rhinelander would be a great game to get reprinted, I'm not sure it's a good business decision to do so. But I do hope someday they make a new version of Rhinelander, and if it's on Kickstarter, I'll probably back it. Gaming pet peeves. Please don't hold back. These can be game-adjacent activities or in-game actions of people you play with, or they could be things like inserts for Settlers of Catan being repurposed by Mayfair for all of their other games just to save money. Speaking of plastic inserts, I love it when there's a really nice plastic insert that has places for everything and it keeps everything neat. But a lot of times, more than it should, they forget one big part of it. So Days of Wonder did this twice with Cargo Noir and with Colosseum. I know Asmodee did this with the first edition of Mission Red Planet. That they had places for everything except the large number of random tokens. In the case of Colosseum and Cargo Noir, they'd be put in a bag. Where do you put the bag? So I don't want to throw out the insert because the insert is so great otherwise, but where do I put this bag? And for the longest time, I'd end up, I'll just dump all the pieces under the insert and then put the insert over it. And every time I play, take out the insert. And you know what? Like Cargo Noir, that's a game I'll probably cover on the channel sometime. My family and I play that. We enjoy it. And I held on to that insert for the longest time because it's a perfect insert, but it doesn't have a room for the big bag of tokens. And in the end, I'm like, we play this enough, I'm just going to lose the insert. And it broke my heart to get rid of that insert but in the end, it was just in the way. I don't like going to a gaming session and being told what to play. So I guess maybe I'm a little bit spoiled from my game group, but there was one time where I was joining another family for games. And they're like, oh, so you're playing games. They're like, hey, Daryl, we're playing games tonight. Are you coming? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll come. And then I would go in, and they would have the game all set up. And it's like, this is the game we're playing tonight. It's like, honestly, had I known that was the game that they wanted to play, I would have said to them, and no hard feelings about it, I don't want to play that game, but you guys go ahead, have fun, right? I'll sit this one out. I'll join you next time, right? And no hard feelings, but they didn't tell me in advance. And when I get there, I'm in an awkward position because I really, really don't want to play that game. I know it's a game that I won't like, but I can't get out of it, right? It would be a bit of a dick move for me to say, oh, you're playing that, huh? And then immediately turn around and leave. And I'm sure they would say, oh, if he didn't want to play that, he could have just said so, and then we would have played something else. Like, yeah, but you set the game up already. For me to tell you that I don't want to play that, then you got to put everything away. And obviously your heart was set on playing this game, so I feel like the villain now. If you have a particular plan, like if you're hosting, and there's a particular game that you want to play, be upfront about it. Tell your game group, hey guys, I'm hosting a game session at my place on Thursday night, and I'm really hoping to play this game. Are you in or out? Don't surprise people when they come. Like for me, if you don't tell me what game is going to be played, so I have an opportunity to back out, I'm going to assume that it's, up for discussion when I get there. And in that case, don't set the game up in advance. I'm going to tell a story. So there was a game store that was pretty close to my home, and they're not around anymore, unfortunately, but they were trying to get their, weekly game sessions up and going, right? So they were going to have like a game day every Saturday afternoon or something, board game day. And they were trying to get it up and going, and so I was trying to support them, so I would go as well. So one time the owner, because this was his second location, and they had a first location, and they're like, well, he apparently went to some of his regulars at the other location. It was like, hey guys, can you come to the second location for like this game session, because I'm trying to get it up and going. And so I got there, and it was only shortly after the game session was scheduled to start, and there were 5 people already there. I was the 6th person to enter. Now, these 5 people all knew each other, and they were the 5 that were from the other store. And they were setting up Battlestar Galactica. And so I asked if I could join them, and they said no. I know this game plays 6 players. So there's a few possibilities here. What are they? A, I understand Battlestar Galactica is, I've heard, optimal at 5 players. But honestly, you're just going to let a 6th person sit out and just, sit there on his own hands, bored? Because you want to play at the optimal player count? Or you had just your friends and you just wanted to play with your friends and you didn't want to have a new person come in, but honestly, maybe I would have been their friend. But they just decided they would rather have the 6th person just sit there alone. There's nobody else there. I waited around for like 20 minutes and nobody else showed up, and I left. And don't be that type of group. Okay, one more pet peeve here. The pet peeve, broadly speaking, is assuming that if someone is into board games, that they are also into fantasy and science fiction. All right? I remember one time I was playing a game with a friend of mine and 2 other people that were his friends, but I didn't know them very well. And we were playing a game. I don't remember what the game was exactly. Let's just say St. Petersburg. It's ostensibly about a period of Russian history, but it's a relatively abstract game. So I'm, enjoying this game, playing this game, and my friend and his 2 friends were chatting, and then they started talking about Firefly, the television show Firefly, I guess because they loved the show. Now, I didn't really have anything to contribute to the conversation, but it's fine. Just continue to play the game, and they're enjoying conversation, right? I'm good. But maybe my friend felt that I was being left out of the conversation, so he turned to me and said, "Oh, so Daryl," I forget what the question was, but it was something assuming a level of familiarity with Firefly. Might have been like, what's your favorite episode? Something like that, right? Anyway, it was assuming that I was very familiar with Firefly already. And I replied, honestly, I had never seen the show. Literal jaws dropping all around the table. And my friend jokes, "Turn in your geek badge right now." I'm like, yeah, I'm not a geek. I think there's a few things going on. One is there's an adjacency to role-playing and collectible card games and miniature war games and video games, all of which are predominantly fantasy. But I'm coming in to board games more along the lines of the St. Petersburg type games, right? Those aren't fantasy. But for some people, there's an assumption that if you're into one, you're into the other. And some of that confusion also comes into play because of the very popular board gaming website, Board Game Geek. And at this point, I should mention that there are sort of two definitions of geek, okay? A geek can be somebody who's just passionately into a hobby, any hobby, such that they know obscure stats that other people wouldn't know, right? You could be a baseball geek. If you described yourself as a baseball geek, I know what that is. You'd probably know lots of stats, RBIs or whatever. I'm not into baseball. So in that sense, I am a board game geek. I am geeky about board games. I can geek out. I can accost a random stranger and tell them obscure board game facts until they plead with me to let them go. But the problem is, if you just say geek, you don't say sports geek, you don't say movie geek, you don't say board game geek, you just say geek, that creates an image in your head. And the image is somebody who's probably a little bit too much into fantasy and science fiction. So that confusion, I think, is part of it. But there is an assumption, for whatever reason, that if you're into board games, you must also be into Firefly. And no, I am not a geek in that sense. I am not interested in fantasy and science fiction. And I actually don't like it to be assumed that somebody who's into board games is into that stuff. Hobbyists don't realize that fantasy and science fiction themes are actually a turnoff for a lot of people, in that if they're not into fantasy and science fiction, and they would otherwise be interested in a hobby, but that hobby is, in their eyes, mostly fantasy and science fiction, they will actually decide that hobby is not for them. I have seen it happen. I have more affinity, or I feel more of a connection to 4 old women playing mahjong than I do with a group of people debating who the best captain is, Kirk or Picard. To me, it's about the love of board games, and board games cast such a wide net, or they can. They include Scrabble and Monopoly and Clue and Risk and Yahtzee, and they can include chess and Go and checkers and Reversey, and they can include Mahjong and Do Di Ju and Big Two and all those, Chinese card games, for example. Gaming is one of the most universal activities, and everybody can enjoy it. Everybody can get into gaming. Thinking back to the early 2000s, is there anything about the hobby now and or your place within the hobby that surprises you? Well, first of all, Asmodee becoming the big giant in the hobby, I did not see that coming. Early on in the hobby, the big thing among hobbyists was evangelizing, okay? So to the average person, if you just said board game, they would picture Monopoly or Clue or Risk or Scrabble. It was the mission of a lot of us to try to introduce new people to the hobby, to introduce them to better board games. Most people hadn't heard of Catan or Carcassonne or, later 2004, Ticket to Ride. So we would go to introduce games to our family, to our colleagues, to our classmates, to our church group, and just to tell people, like, oh my God, these games exist, and a lot of them are from another country, so it's understandable you wouldn't have heard of them. But they're amazing, you have to try it. Nowadays, it seems like hobbyists don't care at all about evangelizing. I mean, a lot of people now have heard of Catan and Ticket to Ride. My local drugstore sells Catan and Ticket to Ride. I recognized early on that an obstacle for introducing more people into the hobby is the geeky side of it. What happens is people's self-image is very important, okay? There are people who say, oh yeah, I'm into, sports, and I'm into this stuff and that stuff, and, maybe fantasy, science fiction, they kind of look down on, right? So it's not that they look down on it. If you're into that sort of thing, great, but they don't see themselves as the type of person who would be interested in that. So if you're introducing board games and you're introducing Catan and Ticket to Ride, literally anybody can enjoy those games. any age group, any background. It's for a game for everyone. But if you have a super geeky theme, fantasy and science fiction, you're cutting off a number of those people because those people don't identify as geeks. They don't have a particular love of fantasy and science fiction, and they don't see themselves as the type of person who would like fantasy and science fiction. So if they see games as geeky, instead of thinking, hey, maybe I would also be interested in this geeky stuff, they will instead say, oh, maybe board games aren't for me. It's not about that thing specifically. It's a matter of self-identification. How do they see themselves? Do they see themselves as a board gamer? Do they see themselves as going to board gaming sessions? And if they see board gaming sessions as something that geeks do at your local comic book store, well, unless they think of themselves as that type of person, then they're going to exclude themselves. They're going to choose that. Anyway, it was very important to me very early on in the hobby that when I was evangelizing, that's always been a passion and still is, to introduce board games in the best possible light. When people would say, oh, like Monopoly, I would say, well, more like Scrabble. Because Scrabble is great because it's thinky, right? But there's still an element of randomness. The best player usually wins, but not always. It's not perceived as geeky. It's a little bit nerdy, I guess, but it's not geeky. Like, regular people play Scrabble and enjoy it. So to me, comparing our board games, these games of ours, Tigu, that's a term you don't hear anymore, to comparing these games of ours to Scrabble was a good comparison to make. Well, like Monopoly, it's like, well, more like Scrabble. Like, oh, okay, yeah, Scrabble. I almost felt like there was not a battle, but there was different approaches going on behind the scenes. There were people like me who was presenting board games in the best possible light. And then there were other people who were just reveling in the other side of it, the geeky side of it. And it's like, well, if they don't want to play the complex, nerdiest, geekiest games, then we don't want them in the hobby, right? This hobby is for us. I mean, I've been trying to introduce games in the best possible light, and I still do. But I've lost that battle. Now, it's interesting because now board games are considered geeky, I think, 100%. Hobby board games are considered geeky. But Catan, Ticket to Ride, Carcassonne, they're not considered hobby games anymore. If I can buy them at my local drugstore, they're not really hobby games, right? They're mass market games now. And geeky themes, fantasy and science fiction, have become more mainstream with stuff like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and whatnot. So, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I'll still keep presenting games the way I want people to see games. I will present games the way I see games, and I want other people to see games as just a lovely pastime that everybody can enjoy, not just for geeks. Well, I think I'll stop there. It's actually quite late where I am now, and so I'm going to stop there. This is going to be a pretty long episode, so thanks for sticking through to the end. I hope I didn't get too ranty. I hope I didn't turn you off. You, as a viewer of Board Gems, you can kind of get a sense of where I'm coming from. It's important when somebody's reviewing a game, you can't look at it as this objective thing, like that game is a 7 out of 10 or something. Everything is subjective, and it's subjective on the reviewer. And it's important that you know this reviewer, his background, where he's coming from, what type of games he likes. And it's from that background and this context that I provided you in this video and the previous ones that hopefully give you a sense of how I tick and add some necessary context for evaluating my opinions on games in the future. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, older games don't stop being good just because newer games come out. Take care.